Bismillah, alhamdulillah, wassalatu wassalam ala rasulillah wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa man tabi'a sunnatahu ila yawmiddin. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome again to another episode of your weekly Islamic chat show, Guest of the Week, coming into you from Sharjah TV, Sharjah Broadcasting Authority. As always, I'm your host Ismail Bullock, and today inshallah we want to talk about something that in theory is relevant to all of us, whether male or female, maybe sometimes more to the male side of things, but not exclusively for males. And people are wondering now, what is this topic? We're going to talk about protecting your gaze or lowering your gaze. And we know this is a principle that's mentioned in the Quran. So we're going to emphasize on that inshallah and talk about some of the reasons why, some of the benefits, I would imagine we're also going to come across some of the very negative effects and that can come from not protecting your gaze or lowering your gaze. And to do that with me again, we had on a previous episode brother Muhammed Abu Zakaria from the UK. Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Jazakallah for coming on again.
For having me.
I mentioned it's not exclusively obviously for especially in modern day and age, surprisingly, but I guess it is more of a, in a sense, something that may be associated more with the male gender, who tend to have the issue of lowering the gaze. But we know it's not something exclusive. Even Islamically, it's not exclusive, as we know from the ayat. It's not something exclusive for men. So we're going to mention some points on the why. People say, what is this big issue about lowering the gaze? Of course, but what's the problem if I look a little bit here and there? Window shopping, as they say. When we have these many, we can, especially depending where you're from, we can relate to these kind of not slogans or catchphrases, I guess, of window shopping or what just a look won't hurt, that kind of thing. So we can obviously talk about how does Islam view that and why do we have this principle in the first place.
It's very interesting that this topic in general. I think one of the most important things before we even go into it is actually strike an example, because with examples it tends to bring the concept closer to the person's heart. And from these examples, there was a situation where there was an individual who was taking pictures that were not correct, both on society standards or on an Islamic standard. It just wasn't right. And to do this, he was using a laptop and a camera. And he was storing the images on the laptop, and he was using a camera to take the pictures. So one day the authorities, they got a sniff of this, and they got told what the situation was. So they went to the person's house and they found the individual and they found the equipment that he was using. So a question was posed: do they just take and confiscate the camera that they were using? Do they just confiscate the laptop they were using? Or do they confiscate both? Now, an intellectual or anybody would say that the most common thing to do is to confiscate both. Now in this example, the camera that's being talked about here is the eyes of the person, and the laptop, the storage unit, is the heart. And so this concept of that which is going to go through your eyes is connected to your heart is very important as a foundation to be placed before you even talk about the concept of the eyes. Because when you make a distinction between the way you use your limbs and the condition of your heart and your iman and your belief in Allah, you start to fall into a problem of not addressing the consequences of certain actions. So this concept that the eyes are a gateway and that will pump through things into the heart is something that needs to be established. Because you see, Allah Azza wa Jalla, He said, قُلْ هُوَ الَّذِي أَنْشَأَكُمْ وَجَعَلَ لَكُمُ السَّمْعَ وَالْأَبْصَارَ وَالْأَفْئِدَةَ قَلِيلًا مَا تَشْكُرُونَ. He is the one who created for you and made for you and produced for you the hearing, the eyesight, and the fu'ad, and the hearts. Little are you grateful. We know now that the eyes are a blessing from Allah. And not only are they a blessing from Allah, they are also a property of Allah. And them being a property of Allah means that they are just only on loan to us. And whenever you loan something, you always have to return it back the same way you got it in the first place, without damaging it, without scratching it, without making it worse than how it used to be. So when we apply this concept to the eyes, we can start to understand what it really means to be grateful with them. And that is to only ever use them in that which is pleasing to Allah Azza wa Jal. So starting with that concept, what did Allah Azza wa Jal say about the eyes in the Quran? He said, قُلْ لِلْمُؤْمِنِينَ يَغُضُّوا مِنْ أَبْصَارِهِمْ يَحْفَظُونَ فُرُوجَهُمْ ذَلِكَ أَزْكَى لَكُمْ إِنَّ اللَّهَ خَبِيرٌ بِمَا يَصْنَعُونَ. Say to the believing people. Now he said to the believing people, the believers, so this constitutes of the men and the women. Unless you have a reason to take the women out of it, it constitutes the men of the women. So the default position in general is that both the parties have to lower their gaze and to protect their private parts. That is more pure for them. That allows them to gain tazkiyah, that allows them to gain purification. Inna Allah khabirun bima yasna'un. Allah is ever aware of that which they are producing, that which they are doing.
And I think, subhanAllah, the ayah slip. I'm pretty sure there's another ayah that mentions the ghadr basar for the men and the women specifically.
Yeah, subhanAllah.
But subhanAllah, it slipped my... I don't want to misquote it because I can quote half of the ayah, but I don't want to misquote it. But if I remember correctly, there's an ayah that specifically mentions to the men and to the women. Because I can even
100%. And then when Allah does that, it shows the importance that both parties are going to be included in that. When both parties are mentioned, Allah Azza wa Jalla it doesn't have to do that, because the default position is that when you use the male, is that the women are included inside that. So, but using both of them separately shows the importance of that concept. So, this idea of the gaze and using it, there's to show you the effects that it has on the person. Ibn Qayyim rahimahullah gave a very good example of a poisoned arrow. Now, he said that the look that is not allowed, that is not allowed, is like shooting a poisoned arrow. So when you first look, you're shooting the arrow, and then when you take that look and you allow yourself to ponder over that look, you carry on, then that arrow, it hits the heart. And then when you carry on looking, what happens is that poison starts to spread and you start to become desensitized to that which you're doing. First of all, you knew you shouldn't be doing it, and then after that we carried on doing it, and it caused the person to become desensitized. And the last final step is that the heart ends up dying. So this step-by-step process of the look shows you the importance of actually giving care to what you are looking at. So what is it that the human being or the Muslim isn't supposed to look at? Primarily, it is the opposite gender. Now, there's many reasons to why Allah has said that, and inshallah we're going to go through them today, some of them bi'idhnillahi ta'ala. But the fact that Allah has told us that it's not lawful for a man to look at a woman, and it's not lawful for a woman to look at a man if in her situation in a lustful way, then the Muslim, first of all, what he does, going back to the veneration of Allah Azza wa Jal, is that he or she decides that if Allah told me not to do it, then there's benefit in it for me, even if I might not comprehend it. So the Muslim starts to take care of his eyesight. But it's funny because Allah Azza wa Jal, He mentions in the Quran, وَلَا تَقْرَبُوا الزِّنَا, don't come close to zina.
That was one of the next things I was going to say, is like, some people say, like we mentioned before, it's just a look. But the fact that Allah says don't even come close, it doesn't say don't fornicate, don't even come close. So logically, that only look, that's where it starts.
Yep.
That woman you're going to go and talk to, that thing you might watch on the internet, it all starts with a look. It doesn't just come right in front of you. And this is just reminds me of another verse, general verse we can use for this and many things. لا تتبعوا خطوات الشيطان, because shaitan comes to you, like the scholar said, he never comes to you straight away and says to you ushrak, it step by step. You always take a khatwa, step by step, and this is the first step, you could say, for legitimate relations or forbidden relations. No doubt comes with, it could come by a phone call, but at some stage the main starting spark comes from the look, because you could speak to someone on the phone and you turn up there and you look at it, or vice versa. So it's the look is the first step.
100%. And saying that you think that we all agree, and it's known throughout anybody that zina is not something that is good. So the fact that Allah told you that which is going to cause that, and that's to stay away from, which is the look, He's already prohibited it. It shows how much Allah is concerned for you, and it shows how much Allah wants you to live a life that is content. Because we all know that, although we know many of the effects of zina, that it corrupts households, that it causes people to get divorced, causes families to be broken, etc. So Allah is already stopping that from the beginning, which shows how much Allah cares for you, that He's decided to make it not allowed for you to look at something because of the harm that's going to bring. So this concept of protecting the gaze and thinking about what you look at, it's not only the actual action we're looking at itself, just the action of looking, rather it's that which is going to lead to. And when you think about the harms of that which is going to lead to, and how big of an action it's going to be, it starts to give you more importance to the smaller action, which is that of the looking. So saying that, we have to always understand what is the preventing factors to why we don't lower our gaze. Because it's all fine to say, we shouldn't be doing this and whatnot, but why? Why don't we lower our gaze? There's two main reasons. The two main reasons I want to first bring up is that Allah Azza said, أَفَرَأَيْتَ مَنِ اتَّخَذَ إِلَهَهُ هَوَاهُ. Have you not seen the one who takes his desires as his God? What do we mean by that? Is it saying that the person is now, because he's looking, he's now worshipping other than Allah? Taking from this ayah is that the person, when he just validates what he wants, or she validates what she wants based on what she feels or he desires, that is what's being talked about here. So when somebody takes away this prohibition of looking and says it's not that bad, it's okay, it's only here and there, just maybe perhaps it's just certain family members, it's okay, then what they're doing is they're saying that my desires are going to tell me what's right and wrong. So it doesn't matter what's prohibited from Allah and His Messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And this is a very important concept that we have to understand why we don't give importance to certain aspects. Because it is true that lowering the gaze, especially in the societies that we live, it can be very difficult nowadays. Sometimes you're trying to lower your gaze downwards, you have to start lowering your gaze upwards because of the things that you might be exposed to. And so this concept of why we don't lower our gaze, firstly can be because we are trying to validate or justify through our own desires and our own emotions. The second point based on that is that Allah Jalla said, وَمَن يَعْشُ عَنْ ذِكْرِ الرَّحْمَنِ نُقَيِّدْ لَهُ شَيْطَانًا فَهُوَ لَهُ قَرِينٌ. Whoever turns away from the remembrance of Allah Azza Jal, then we will attach to him a shaitan, فَهُوَ لَهُ قَرِينٌ, and he to him is a close companion. وَإِنَّهُمْ لَيَسُدُّونَهُمْ عَنْ السَّبِيلِ وَيَحْسَبُونَ أَنَّهُمْ مُهْتَدُونَ. And he, meaning the shayateen, the shaitans, they cause the person to be blocked off from the correct path while they think that they are rightly guided. This concept here is that before we even talk about how to lower the gaze and what the benefits are and what the harms if you don't, is the concept that don't let shaitan trick you into thinking if just because something's accepted by society or accepted by somebody's rational mind, that this is in fact the best thing for somebody to do.
Just hold you on that point, inshallah. Join us, inshallah, after this short break. Assalamu alaikum and welcome back. Now, before you went to the break, you mentioned the verse where Allah says that the one who takes his desires as his God, and that he will have this qareen, this companion, this shaitan, who is with him, and he feels that he's rightly guided. And subhanAllah, you can even look at that from the perspective of humans, your friends. Sometimes you see that you have friends who are more of a shaitan than this qareen. Like we say this, we don't believe that shayateen, we know though there are shayateen al-jinn or shayateen al-ins, that there are shayateen from the jinn and there's shayateen from men. So like you said, there's this thing that's stopping the person from being righteous or realizing that he has these problems and causing barriers to him even being able to get to lowering the gaze. Like you said, these are the things, what are the things that stop us from lowering the gaze? A lot of the time it is the people you hang around with.
Yeah,
you know,
100%. I mean, that was actually the second point I'm going to bring up, is that the bad companionship, because having this, so the first one was the perception of whether or not this is actually right or wrong, which is based on the desires and the people and the way that shaitan speaks to you, whispers to you. The second thing, as you mentioned, is the bad companionship, because there's a big difference between lowering the gaze from something that you saw suddenly and lowering the gaze from a place that you're going to go to. So when you're with bad companionship and you don't give importance to the one that you take as a friend, as the Prophet said, "Al-rajul ala dini khalilih, falyanzur ahadukum ila man yukhalil." The man is, or the person is, on the religion of his friend. And he said khalilih, which is the closest companion, the one that you bring into your inner circles, the one that you say to them, okay, you can come to my house, you can visit my children, and people like that, the ones you bring into closer circles. فَلْيَنْظُرْ أَحَدُكُمْ إِلَى مَنْ يُخَالِلْ. The Prophet said, didn't say فَلْيَرَى, he said فَلْيَنْظُرْ. Look deeply, think properly, contemplate over the one that you take as a close companion, because this person is going to take you to places, this person is going to expose you to things, this person is going to bring things your way. So this preventing factor, this first and foremost of bad companionship, is something that we need to think and really contemplate over ourselves, as who are my friends? Who am I taking as companions? And what are they making me see? Because I'll give you a prime example. For example, if you have somebody who is a friend of yours that, he's known to be someone who's trying to get closer to Allah, someone who's making sure that he's constantly doing what he can to improve himself as a Muslim and to save himself from the hellfire and get closer to Allah and go to Jannah. Then this individual, when he sends you, for instance, a medical article on CPR, he's going to make sure that there's no certain pictures in there that are going to cause you disruption or cause you harm. Whereas the person who's not concerned about these things, he's going to be sending you medical articles that's good and beneficial to read, things about engineering, whatever it may be. But the pictures in there and the content in there is actually quite harmful for the individual. So this is not even your fault, but because of the people that you're around, that these images and things that you get exposed to become plentiful. And this is a very small example, and obviously we can extend it to every single situation that you have.
And you mentioned the fact that this is the khalil. It reminds me of the ayat where it talks about the person on Yawm al-Qiyamah, that he will bite his hands and he will say, Ya layta lam attakhidh fulanan khalila. I wish that I didn't take so and so as a close companion, that he took me away from the straight path after I had been guided. And how many of us, maybe some of the viewers can relate to this, whether now, whether in the past, where they know what's right, but they find themselves going a different path, and this falls in this ayah, that this person that they start hanging around, or these people, took them away from the straight path after I was guided by Allah. So we don't want to make sure that we're not these people on the Day of Judgment are going to regret, and because sometimes you say to yourself, how could you be so silly? I mean, I don't like to do it stupid, but it happens to all of us.
Yep. To
know something is the truth, but then you go a different way, and we can without that doesn't even necessarily mean in sins. You could be someone, and would not mention names. We see people now who have studied Islam and become doctors and with the best of the scholars, and you'll see them taking a completely different way, and you're like, how can a person who studied like this and with these kind of scholars then be turning around and laughing about these kind of scholars and things like this? Yep. So it's not even about sin sometimes. It could be shaitan can come to you from many, many different angles. So it's very important that this companionship, who you hang around with, whether it's religious people sometimes, and what is their thinking.
Yep.
It's all very well saying, they're a bunch of good brothers, but if they're doing practices that are innovations,
100%.
If you find that they say that they love Allah, and then maybe they do love Allah, as we know Allah says in the verse about those, which we could have mentioned also in a previous episode you came on, of those people who take others, make others equal with Allah in worship, and then Allah says, يُحِبُّونَهُمْ كَحُبِّ اللَّهِ. And we mentioned in the previous episode about Shaykh Abdul Razak al-Badr, I specifically remember him explaining this in his Books of Tawheed explanation series, and he mentions this shows that the mushrikeen, they had a hard love of Allah. It's not that they didn't love Allah, but their love of Allah was mixed with shirk. So it's also this, we can look at this from many aspects. Even in our religion, we can't just freely mix with everybody just because it seems they love Allah. They could be loving Allah and they could be grave worshipping. So their love of Allah is deficient.
100%.
So this is also important to make people understand.
100%. So this aspect of companionship, as it can lead to so many different avenues and so many different ways in which it can corrupt you. But the going back to the main point of who you take as companions, you have to always remember that the person is actually choosing those companions as well. So sometimes what happens is you might know this is not good, and you might say, "Oh, my companions are taking me in a certain direction," but you have to always remember that us ourselves are accountable. That we're actually putting ourselves in those positions and not going out and observing who we're going to take as companions. But those are some of the preventing factors for why people don't lower the gaze. The last one to mention is not knowing the consequences. Not knowing the consequences of not lowering the gaze. So this is what we're going to I want to focus on at the moment. Is the consequence? What actually happens when you don't lower the gaze? What are the harming effects when you don't lower the gaze? The first thing that a Muslim should always think in their mind when they look at the effects of any type of sin is that it's disobeying Allah and His Messenger. Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam. That's the most important factor that you should always try and make as the highest possible. Is that firstly, why, if this is wrong because, or this is a damaging effect of this, is that I'm going to be disobeying Allah and His Messenger Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam. So that's one that a whole discussion can be done on. But for practical one is that when you look, it actually becomes an addiction. Because when you look at certain things, certain chemicals are produced in your brain, and also when you feed yourself on certain types of disobedience, you start to do more and more and more of it. And so it's very different to nipping something in the bud and coming away from an addiction. It's two different things. So when you don't give importance, and when you don't give importance to the asl, the default and the most foundational thing of the problem, you start to be dealing with a problem that shouldn't have been there in the first place. So the consequence of actually looking and constantly looking around and not taking care of what you see, it causes you to become addicted to that thing. And subhanAllah, it's a very powerful statement. I believe Ibn al-Qayyim rahimahullah mentioned that the more shameless acts you do, the more of an animal that you end up becoming. And that's a very scary concept, because the difference, we're in a station between angels and animals, right? The angels are the ones that are always obeying Allah Azza wa Jal, and the animals are ones that are going to be created, turned into dust Yawm al-Qiyamah. So you don't want to end up being worse than an animal. While you have the ability to be good, you choose to be like an animal. So this concept of not protecting your eyes, the Muslim has to understand that it's actually going to lead to becoming like those animals.
I think just because you mentioned Ibn al-Qayyim, and we mentioned on many shows before, but I think it's important to mention to the viewer that in these topics that we've mentioned, when you came on a previous episode about venerating Allah and about this concept of lowering the gaze, because no doubt, as you mentioned, and we mentioned, lowering the gaze has a big connection to your iman and your level of iman and your taqwa. And reading the books of Ibn al-Qayyim, which are now widely available in English, various topics, and some of them are such topics, about avoiding hypocrisy and all these kind of different topics about the hearts and the inner dimensions and the prayer and what have you. You find that his readings will help in these kind of matters. And of course, like you mentioned, and we've mentioned, ayat and ahadith, the ayat of the verses of the Quran and the statements of the Prophet Muhammad, no doubt are better. But Ibn al-Qayyim, obviously, a majority of the time is not talking from his own self.
100%.
He is bringing you the ayat and the hadith, but he has his way in relating them to certain aspects of the human nature that we may not ourselves necessarily connect them. So these books are very good for the viewers to go out there and look for these books of Ibn al-Qayyim in such topics. I actually believe he may even have a topic that is relating to lowering the gaze, or similarly has been translated.
There's a very good book called Ad-Da' wa Du'a, the disease and the cures.
And if I remember correctly, subhanAllah, if I'm not confusing it with one of his other books, this was literally written because a man came to him and said, I keep falling into the same sin. So rather than giving him, which would have been fair enough, a 5 or 10 minute explanation or fatwa or advice, he wrote a whole book which can be used by that man and by many other people. 100%. So this is the kind of benefits we can get from these kind of books.
100%, because all these way, especially Ibn al-Qayyim's works, all he's doing is he's giving you the meaning of the ayah and the hadith. So he's bringing you the Quran, the hadith, and putting it there for you, and then he's taking out for you what you need to understand from it. Because sometimes it's very difficult for us as normal people to try and understand what the implications of this ayah is. So that's all that he's doing. And when he does it, you start to realize the magnificence of Allah's words. Because it's all encompassed in that. But it's because of our own deficiency, sometimes we can't bring it out. So I mentioned that on the shamelessness, that person ends up becoming like an animal. Another really important consequence that we have to understand is it actually causes the heart to become dispersed. When you start looking at things that Allah Azza wa Jalla has not allowed you to look at, doesn't want you to look at, because you can look at the mountains, you can look at the Quran, the verses of Allah Azza wa Jalla, you can look at the fruits that Allah Azza wa Jalla has presented to you on this earth, no problem. But there's certain things that you're not allowed to look at, mainly the opposite gender. When you do that, it causes the heart to actually become dispersed, and you find that you can't focus. And this is actually a very important thing, because when I was at university and I was studying studying maths, and I realized that the people that find it most difficult to concentrate are the ones that have this notion of just looking around and enjoying themselves while they look. Their mind becomes dispersed and they can't focus. And the concepts that they're going to try and take in, especially for students or anybody else, that it doesn't settle in the heart because the mind's all dispersed.
It's funny because you find now, even in the West, that a lot of people try to send their children nowadays to male only school, boys only school, girls only school. And of course they don't do it because of the haram and the halal, but deep down if you say why, they said because they're going to focus on their studies. Because we know the reality, we've all been there. A lot of the time you're not focusing on the studies, you're focusing on the girl across the room or whatever it may be, and you spend your time sometimes in the class trying to get to that girl or trying to so they're even doing it there, and you find those are sometimes, majority of the time, the most achieving schools and the students who achieve the most, because it's like you said, when Allah's put rulings down for us, it's because He is our Creator. He knows what's best for us. He knows He knows the every ins and outs of us.
100%.
So it's there's nothing that's forbidden except that there is a benefit. Sometimes we may not know the specific benefit right there and then, but subhanAllah, as time goes, sometimes you hear facts are discovered and you say, subhanAllah, la'alla, maybe this is one of the wisdoms behind this being forbidden, or this being makruh, or this being
100%.
And so this is an important point, that even the West, not from the haram side of things, of course, but from the practicality that people will not study as well with the gender. And on that point, we'll just take a short break. Join us inshallah after this break. Assalamu alaikum and welcome back. Just going back to one of the first points you mentioned about, we went into that topic about Ibn al-Qayyim, and we just recently ended talking about how this, even in the West, the separation of the genders for better study results. But going back to the point you mentioned about the person, because it kind of hit me, the person who keeps falling into this can almost become, like an animal. And sometimes I think when people fall into sins, and this is a good sign, so it's not something for the viewer now, we're not calling him an animal or her an animal, but I think sometimes if you feel, for lack of better words, like a dirty animal, when you've done this sin, then this is actually a good sign, because unfortunately there are many people who have gone into the sin so frequent that, and we mentioned that on another episode, that it's just like, well, there's a fly, it's nothing. So also it's just something that if you do feel like that, you are someone who's watching this, who keeps falling to these, making certain sins, and you do feel really dirty, shameful afterwards, then this is a good sign. And I remember someone came to Sheikh Salih Fawzan and said to him, I'm a young man, or I keep making mistakes, then I ask Allah for forgiveness, then I make mistakes, and the same thing over and over again. He's going through the same kind of sin, but he keeps asking, he said, I feel bad, I make tawbah, but I do it again. And Shaykh Fawzan said, stay upon what you're on. I mean, this is it. The day that you stop feeling that regret and you stop making that tawbah, this is where you really have to worry.
100%, because this comes down to this idea of desensitization. Sometimes when you do something so much, you become desensitized to it and you don't see it to be big. But hopefully mentioning some of these consequences can actually bring closer to the mind of the individual that this is actually quite a severe thing. And one of the other things that causes from the consequences of actually looking is it causes the heart to become sad. Ibn Qayyim rahimahullah mentions something very powerful, is that one of the reasons why sometimes people are so scared of the dark is because they're on their own. They start to think about what they're doing, and somebody who's constantly looking at things that he shouldn't be looking at, these images come to him or her when they're on their own, and it causes the person to become sad and depressed. And when you understand this is a consequence of the looking, you start to realize that happiness will come when you don't. And building upon that, a very, very important thing that we have to remember is one of the reasons that causes so much problem in married life is the looking. What it causes somebody to do is causes one to compare, and two to have unrealistic expectations. So when you start to compare your beautiful wife or your good husband with the things that you're exposing yourself to, you have to remember shaitan is looking to beautify things that you see that are haram. So it might even be that your wife or your husband is better than the person that you're seeing, but the shaitan is purposely trying to beautify that person so it looks as if the one that you have at home is not good. So that's one of the consequences, just like looking. Not that you're doing anything, not that you're doing anything physical, but just by opening your eyes to look, you're in fact comparing that which you have been blessed by Allah Azza wa Jalla at home. So these are some of the consequences. And many others that you can mention. For instance, a weakness of memory. You won't be able to remember things properly, and you become forgetful. But saying that, we want to also talk about some of the benefits of lowering the gaze. When you're obedient to Allah and His Messenger, what are the benefits that you gain? First of all, is obedience to Allah and His Messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Knowing the fact that every time you lower your gaze, for example, when if you know that if you do a righteous deed and you ask Allah through that righteous deed for something, it's a form of seeking means that is permissible in Islam. So when you lower your gaze from something you see and you say, Ya Rabb, I lowered my gaze for your sake. No one's watching me. I ask you to please make it easy for me in my home life. I ask you please make it easy for my application for such and such. Make it easy for me at job. You'll find that those connections that you have at those moments, they're very personal with Allah Azza wa Jalla. And you'll find that you're able to call upon Him in a very sincere time, because the gaze is something that nobody seems to care about anymore. So when you do it for the sake of Allah Azza wa Jalla, you'll find that you're able to use that as a way to call upon Allah Azza wa Jalla, which is a very, very, very big benefit that you have. Another thing is that it actually causes the person to become firm and strong in their iman. So when you're someone who lowers your gaze, you'll find that in situations that are more difficult, for instance, you might be at university but the lecturer says you can't pray, you're going to have to sit in the lesson and say, no, I need to go and pray, I need to go do my obligations. You might be, for instance, on a work trip and somebody's bringing something to the table that's not allowed for you to see or be part of, and you say, no, I'm strong on this issue. Because of the lowering of the gaze that you have, it actually causes the heart to become strong in these situations. So this is a very, very important concept, that this obedience of lowering the gaze will strengthen the individual's heart. The last thing to mention from regards to the benefits is that the mind starts to open up. We mentioned that it can weaken the mind, it can cause you not to focus. But when you start to lower the gaze, your mind starts to open up to information that's going to be presented to you, and starts to think about things more deeply. And like we mentioned, Ibn Qayyim rahimahullah, who takes the ayat and the hadith and he brings out benefits that maybe we were probably not going to see. But because the mind of the individual is protected from these things that are going to corrupt it, it allows the person to contemplate and think over the signs of Allah Azza wa Jalla, over the benefits that we have in this world, and starts to really become somebody who his heart is yearning and longing for Allah Azza wa Jalla. All of this is just from lowering the gaze, from a very small and simple action. But when you see the consequences to it and the benefits to it, you start to give it a higher station and more importance. So saying all that, it's important to mention, how do we stop ourselves from doing this problem? What is it we can do to prevent ourselves from looking at things that we shouldn't be looking at? One very important concept we have in Islam, a qaida, a principle that is almost consistent: al-jazā'u bi jinsi al-amal. The actions are recompense depending on that which is done. When you look, think to yourself, I'm looking at this person's wife, I'm looking at this person's husband, I'm looking at this person's child, whatever it may be, someone's going to do the same to you, unless Allah protects you from that. That's a very powerful concept, that no matter where you are in your life, that the consequences of your actions will be seen, if not in this world, in the next world. So that's a very thing that really prevents the person from looking unnecessarily. Second thing is looking unnecessarily. Sometimes what will happen is, for instance, we go to places and we're dozing around and we're looking this left and right, and we're never focused on what we'd actually come to do. And when we do that, we start to see things that we didn't need to see in the first place. Looking up and left and right, places like, for instance, in the gym, you're looking all over the place, so you see things that you could have avoided seeing in the first place. So that concept of unnecessarily looking is very important, and this actually comes down to the Muslim himself. Is somebody who's always busied in good, because if you're not busying yourself in good, you're only opening yourself up to doing that which is not good. And so a preventing factor for all sins in general actually is that you're always trying to engage yourself in good. You say, okay, I've got 3 hours to do now. What am I going to do? Am I going to, for instance, go visit an orphanage? Am I going to go help my mother? Am I going to go seek some beneficial knowledge? Whatever it may be. When you're engaged in good, you start to stay away from that which is going to harm you from that good. And one powerful concept that's sometimes not always spoken about, but there's a reason why Allah spoke about it in the Quran, is remembering the women of paradise. Now, why did Allah Azza wa Jal put so much emphasis on the women of paradise for the men? Because this concept word akhiratu khayrun wa abqa, that which is in the hereafter is better and it lasts longer. Having this always in the person's mind and knowing that which is going to get in the future, or that which she's going to get in the future, causes the person to find the sacrifice of not doing this sin, not looking, to be something that's very small. And that's important, because when you see this, staying away from the sins as something very difficult in yourself, you start to find it difficult to implement it. But when you see it as something very small compared to the reward that you're going to get, you find the motivation towards staying away from it is very easy. Very, very easy. And so this concept of cutting off the avenues towards doing something wrong is one that is a fundamental part and fundamental motivation to keeping somebody away from looking at things that he shouldn't be looking at, or she from looking at things that she shouldn't be looking at. And of course there's many other things that you can mention from the benefits and from the harms of this one thing. But there's an ayah in the Quran, Allah said, يَعْلَمُ خَائِنَةَ الْأَعْيُنِ وَمَا تُخْفِي الصُّدُورُ. Allah, He knows the fraud of the eyes. This concept of that Allah Azza is watching you, He's writing things down, and He's seeing you, is something that really shakes the believer's heart. And then He said, وَمَا تُخْفِي الصُّدُورُ, and that which the chest conceal. Because the truth is that look is one of the few sins that many of the people will never see you do. And so when you stop doing it, it's most likely that you're sincere, because people don't know that you stopped.
And I think that the fact that today we have all the internet and all the various options available, that it reminds me of the hadith that talks about the person who will have like mountains of good deeds, but they will become like nothing. And the reason behind it is because when they were alone, they came or they approached or they did the maharim, the things that's sinful, and that was mentioned back then. There was no internet, there was no screens. Imagine today how many people may at some time of us have fallen into that thing where you're alone, the TV, the internet. It's that kind of hadith is more pertinent, because and it can happen to the best of people. That person could be someone with lots of ibadah, could be someone with lots of dhikr, and he says to himself, alhamdulillah, I always pray, I've got so much dhikr. So he thinks that half an hour every day or 1 hour every day of him watching whatever he's watching when mum and dad or whatever, no one's around and he's alone in his room, it's not a big thing in the comparison. But if that hadith mentions all those good deeds like mountains became like dust. Why? Because like we mentioned in a previous episode, he didn't have enough veneration of Allah, that when he's alone, no one's here, no one's watching me. Of course he knows Allah's watching him, but at that moment it's all gone, and he thinks no one can see me, and he goes ahead of it. And again, that starts with not lowering the gaze.
See, that is amazing that you mentioned that, because it reminds me of what my teacher Abdul Hassan Hafidhullah mentioned, which is a very, very big benefit. He said that how is it that we can make Allah Azza wa Jal from the lowest of those that look at us. So from the thing that you mentioned, when you're on your own, you don't feel as if, it's not as big of a deal because you're on your own. But in fact, what is more of a deal, because you're saying that when somebody respected in your community, or somebody that you see on the streets, they see you do this, it's bad, you shouldn't do it. But when the one who sees everything sees you doing this, and he's the only one who sees you doing this, then you find that it's okay to do. So this concept is very much something that extends to the person's knowledge of Allah Azza wa Jal, and the person's fear of the fact that if she or he doesn't see this to be a sin, then he's going to fall into this a lot. But based on what you mentioned, a very good preventing factor for that I found that people can do, and this takes a bit of encouragement. Obviously, you can always look for help, which is very, very important. That's actually something that's encouraged in our religion, to look for help when you're in certain situations. But simply, if you've got a laptop, if you've got a phone, whatever, electronic device, whatever it may be, get one of your friends to just put a passcode on it. Certain websites that you might go onto, certain things avenues that you might explore, if you ask somebody that you trust and say, can you just put a code on it? So anytime I try to go on this website or this place, it's prevented by my laptop or my phone. And you'll find that the Sharia, it really encourages this concept of sadd al-dhari'a, cutting off from that which is going to lead to that which is worse.
We're going to have to stop you there, because mashallah we could probably keep on talking, but we've come to the end of this episode. Jazakallah khair for coming on. And may Allah reward you for tuning in, and hopefully this can be something we can all implement, inshallah, in our lives, what we've heard today, inshallah. And until the same time, the same place, inshallah, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.